Hello, my love. Please, where are you? I have missed you so much.
Hello? Please, where are you?
Silence can be a shield, but it can also be a grave. For 2 years, the silence in the high-rise offices of the Kong Syndicate has been absolute. A mourning ritual for a woman the world believes is long gone. But at 11:11 p.m., the silence didn't just break, it screamed. When the encrypted phone of a dead woman begins to vibrate against a mahogany desk, it isn't a glitch in the system. It's a message from the shadows. While the rest of Seoul's underworld sleeps, believing they have successfully buried the heart of their boss, Kong Do-hwan is about to learn that the most dangerous lies aren't told by enemies. They are whispered by those we trust most. He didn't pick up the phone for power. He didn't pick it up for the syndicate. He did it because a soul isn't defined by a death certificate, but by the voice that refuses to stop calling home. Tonight, Do-hwan, the man who commands thousands with a single nod, is about to be brought to his knees by a single hello. He's about to discover that his grief was a weapon used against him, and the ghost he's been mourning is actually a prisoner waiting for his warpath. If this mystery has you gripped, smash that like button and share this with someone who believes in love beyond the grave. Subscribe and hit the bell, because next week we're uncovering the story of a forgotten heir and the secret that could topple a throne. Seoul's neon lights in the rain never really illuminate the truth. They only make the shadows longer, like a secret pressed against the glass of a skyscraper. The glass walls of the Kong Syndicate headquarters usually acted as a mirror, reflecting a man of unshakable power, but tonight they were a window into a nightmare. Outside, the rain-slicked streets of Seoul shimmered with the cold glow of 1,000 neon signs. But inside the penthouse, the only light came from the frantic, rhythmic pulsing of a dead woman's phone. Kong Do-hwan didn't move. His breath hitched in his throat, a sharp, jagged contrast to the professional silence he had cultivated for years. 2 years ago, he had watched the flames consume the wreckage of the car that carried Bae Soo-ah. He had felt the heat of the fire, smelled the acrid scent of burning rubber and expensive perfume, and he had buried an empty casket to the sound of a weeping cello. The phone in front of him, her phone, was supposed to be a mangled piece of scrap metal at the bottom of the Han River. Yet, as the clock struck 11:11 p.m., the device vibrated with a terrifying mechanical life. The name on the screen, My Life, burned into his retinas. It was a cruel ghost in a digital shell. With a hand that shook so violently he could barely command his fingers, Do-hwan reached out. The air in the room felt thin, as if the oxygen were being sucked out by the sheer impossibility of the moment. He swiped the screen. The haptic feedback felt like a spark of electricity jumping from the grave into his palm. He pressed the phone to his ear, his eyes wide and glassy, fixed on the empty space near the window where the moonlight seemed to catch on a stray shadow, forming the ethereal outline of a woman in a white dress. "Hello," he whispered. The word was broken, a plea rather than a greeting. At first, there was only the hollow hiss of white noise, the sound of a long-distance connection spanning worlds. But then it came, a soft, hitching intake of air. It was a wet, ragged breath, heavy with the weight of exhaustion and terror. He knew that sound. He had memorized the rhythm of her lungs over a decade of shared pillows and whispered secrets. Duva. The voice was a ghost of the melody it once was, cracked and trembling. But it was hers. It wasn't a recording. It wasn't a digital fabrication. There was a specific, melodic lilt to the way she said his name, the slight hesitation on the second syllable, that no AI could ever replicate. Sua. He stood up, so abruptly his heavy leather chair skidded back across the polished floor. "Sua, where are you? How is this?" "Please," she sobbed, and the sound of her crying was a blade through his chest. "They're coming back." "Du-Hwan, I never died." The line went dead with a sharp, final click. In the sudden silence of the office, Du-Hwan stood frozen, the phone still pressed to his ear as the realization shattered his world. He hadn't just lost 2 years to grief. He had lost them to a lie. And someone in his own empire was holding the keys to her cage. The dial tone was a flat line, a sudden and brutal end to the miracle that had just occurred. For a long, suffocating minute, Du-Hwan didn't move. He stood in the center of his sprawling office, the phone still pressed to his ear until the plastic grew warm against his skin. The silence of the penthouse, once a sanctuary for his mourning, now felt like a predatory thing, closing in on him with teeth bared. He looked at the device in his hand. The screen had gone black again, as if the last 60 seconds had been nothing more than a localized tear in the fabric of his sanity. But he could still feel the phantom vibration in his palm. He could still hear the specific, desperate tremor in Sua's voice. "Secretary Choi," he muttered, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. He didn't call for his guards. Instead, he moved with the practiced, lethal efficiency of a man who had spent his life navigating minefields. He opened a lacquer box on his desk, pulling out a high-frequency signal detector. He began to sweep the room, the device's small amber light flickering like a nervous heartbeat. He moved past the leather sofas, under the edge of the mahogany table, and behind a framed photograph of their wedding day. If she was alive, if she had been calling from a prison for 2 years, then every inch of his life was compromised. Every word he had spoken in this room, every tear he had shed in the dark, had been witnessed by the monsters who stole her. The detector remained silent, but the air in the room grew thick and heavy, charged with an energy that made the hair on his arms stand up. He walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, the glass a cold barrier between his ivory tower and the sprawling, neon-soaked labyrinth of Seoul. The city below was a sea of artificial light, electric blues, piercing pinks, and toxic greens. Yet none of it could touch the shadow standing right beside him. He didn't need to turn his head to feel her. In the reflection of the glass, a soft, ethereal glow began to manifest. It was the faint, semi-transparent outline of a woman in a flowing white dress, her presence as delicate as a thumbprint on silk. She stood just behind his shoulder, not a ghost of the dead, but a psychic tether to the living. He watched her reflection, her calm, distant expression mirroring the one he remembered from their quietest mornings. "I'm coming for you," he whispered to the glass, his breath fogging the image of her face. The reflection didn't speak, but the weight of the silence changed. It was no longer the silence of grave. It was the quiet before a storm. Du-Hwan realized then that his grief had been a blindfold, and the neon lights of the city were no longer just decorations. They were the map to a war he was finally ready to fight. The heavy oak doors of the office groaned as they swung open, a sound that usually signaled the arrival of subordinates seeking a signature. But tonight, it sounded like the clicking of a trap. Du-Hwan didn't flinch. With the muscle memory of a man who had spent a decade hiding his true hand, he slipped the encrypted phone into the deep pocket of his suit jacket just as a shadow stretched across the polished mahogany floor. Secretary Choi stepped into the room, his expression a masterpiece of practiced concern. He was a man of precise movements and iron creases, the one who had handled the funeral arrangements, the one who had held the umbrella over Du-Hwan's head as they lowered Saw's empty casket into the earth. "Sir, you're still here," Choi said, his voice smooth and soothing, like oil over a burn. "The board is concerned. You've missed 3 briefings today. They say the grief is starting to affect the bottom line." Du-Hwan turned away from the window, his face a mask of cold granite. He watched Choi's eyes, the way they darted toward the desk, scanning for anything out of place. The framed photo, the glass of untouched whiskey, the silence. Choi's smile was thin, a professional courtesy that didn't reach his eyes. It was the smile of a man who thought he was standing over a corpse, not a predator who had just found a scent. "The bottom line is fine, Choi," Du-Hwan replied, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He walked toward his desk, deliberately keeping his hand near the pocket where the phone lay hidden. "I was just thinking about the night of the accident. Funny how the mind works at 11:11, isn't it?" Choi's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a micro-expression of tension that would have been invisible to anyone else. "The past is a heavy burden, sir. Perhaps it's time to stop looking for ghosts in the dark." "I don't have to look for them anymore," Du-Hwan said, stepping into Choi's personal space, the air between them suddenly electric with unsaid threats. "They've started finding me." He watched as Choi's throat moved in a shallow swallow. The game of cat and mouse had begun, but for the first time in 2 years, Du-Hwan wasn't the prey. He could feel the weight of the phone against his thigh, a secret weapon that Choi didn't know existed. As Choi excused himself with a stiff bow, Du-Hwan realized the traitor wasn't just in his office. He was his right hand. The war had moved from the streets to the very heart of his home. And the first casualty would be the man who thought he could keep a queen in a cage. The rain didn't just fall in Seoul that night. It descended like a heavy, gray shroud, drowning the neon hum of the city in a relentless rhythmic drumming. Du-Hwan drove himself, his knuckles white against the steering wheel of the black sedan as he sped toward the outskirts of the city. He didn't take the main roads, avoiding the cameras and the prying eyes of his own security detail. He was a man who had built his life on the certainty of death, but tonight he was chasing the impossible possibility of life. The cemetery was a sprawling, silent kingdom of marble and shadow. As Du-Hwan stepped out of the car, the cold mud pulled at his expensive leather shoes, but he didn't feel the chill. He moved through the rows of headstones with the precision of a ghost, his eyes fixed on the highest point of the hill where the Bay family vault stood. It was a masterpiece of grief, a stone monument he had commissioned to house the woman he thought he'd lost. He reached the grave, the white marble slick and gleaming under the occasional flash of distant lightning. 2 years ago, he had stood here and felt his soul being lowered into the ground. Now, he knelt in the dirt, his hands sweeping over the base of the monument. Hidden beneath a decorative lip of granite was a small, sophisticated sensor, part of a state-of-the-art security grid he had installed to ensure no one would ever disturb or rest. It was supposed to alert his personal phone to even the slightest vibration of the earth. He pulled a small handheld tablet from his pocket and bypassed the encryption. His breath hitched. The logs weren't empty. They were looped. The sensor showed a perfect, flatline status for the last 700 days, but the internal clock was lagging by a fraction of a second, a telltale sign of a digital patch. Someone had hijacked the feed, feeding him a pre-recorded loop of silence while the grave was actually being breached. With a low, guttural growl of realization, Du-Hwan pulled a heavy crowbar from his coat. He didn't care about the sacrilege. The true desecration had happened long ago. As he wedged the steel into the seal of the stone slab and heaved, the heavy lid groaned and shifted. When the space finally opened, the beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness of the vault, illuminating the velvet-lined interior of the casket. It was empty. No silk shroud, no withered flowers, and no bay suah. There wasn't even the scent of decay, only the sterile, cold smell of a trap that had been set years ago. He stared into the velvet void, his glassy eyes reflecting the harsh light. The call hadn't been a haunting, it had been a rescue signal. Suah wasn't a ghost, and he wasn't a widower. He was a king who had been ruling over a kingdom of lies, and the people he called brothers were the ones who had stolen his queen. As the lightning cracked overhead, illuminating the hollow grave, Du-Hwan realized he wouldn't be mourning tonight. He would be hunting. The drive back from the cemetery was a blur of adrenaline and cold, calculated fury. Du-Hwan sat in the darkened interior of his car, the engine idling in the shadows of an alleyway 2 blocks from his headquarters. He didn't want to be seen, not yet. His suit was stained with the mud of a hollow grave, and his mind was a battlefield of shifting loyalties. He stared at the encrypted phone resting on the passenger's seat, waiting for the only truth left in his world to ring out once more. When it finally vibrated, he snatched it up before the first second had passed. "Sua," he breathed, his voice a low, jagged rasp. "Duvang." Her voice was weaker this time, a frayed thread of sound that seemed to be slipping away. "I don't have long. They check the basement every hour. Tell me where you are," he demanded, his eyes scanning the rain-streaked windshield as if the answer were written in the neon reflections of the city. "Give me anything. A sound, a smell, a direction." There was a long silence, filled only by the rhythmic, metallic clanging of something in the distance on her end. He held his breath, straining to hear through the static of the illicit connection. "Bells," she whispered finally. "I hear bells, Du-Hwan, but they aren't church bells. They're heavy, rhythmic. And the air, it tastes like salt and old iron. Every time the wind shifts, I can hear the cranes groaning." Du-Hwan's mind raced through a mental map of Seoul and its surrounding industrial fringes. The salt, the heavy clanging, the groaning of massive machinery. It wasn't the city center. He closed his eyes, visualizing the Incheon harbor, the sprawling, rusted labyrinth of shipping containers and decommissioned warehouses where the tides of the Yellow Sea beat against the concrete. "The bells," he murmured, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "The buoy bells at the south terminal. You're at the harbor." "It's cold here," she sobbed, the sound of her breaking voice igniting a fire in his veins that threatened to consume his restraint. "So cold. They talk about a shipment, something arriving at dawn." "Du-Hwan, please," they said, "if the deal goes through, they won't need me as leverage anymore." The implication hung in the air, cold and final. She wasn't just a prisoner. She was a countdown. "Stay quiet," he commanded, his voice regaining the iron authority of the man who had built an empire. "Don't let them see the light of that phone. I'm coming for you, Sua. I'm going to burn that harbor to the ground to find you." The line cut out, replaced by the hollow hum of the Soul Knight. Du-Hwan gripped the steering wheel until the leather groaned. He knew that location. It was a sector of the docks officially overseen by Secretary Choi's personal security firm. The trap was no longer a mystery. It was a destination. He shifted the car into gear, the tires screaming against the wet pavement as he turned toward the salt air and the sound of the bells. He wasn't going to call for backup. He couldn't trust the men he had paid to protect him. Tonight, the king would do his own killing. The rain had transitioned from a downpour to a thick, suffocating mist as Du-Hwan pulled his car back into the underground garage of the Kong Syndicate headquarters. He didn't head to his office. Instead, he made his way to the sub-level tactical room, a windowless bunker where his most elite security detail waited in perpetual readiness. The air here was sharp with the smell of gun, oil, and ozone. 6 men stood at attention as he entered. These were men he had handpicked, men whose families he had supported and whose lives he supposedly owned. Among them was Park, the head of his field operations, and a direct report to Secretary Choi. "Change of plans," Du-Hwan said, his voice dropping into a register of cold, quiet authority that made the room grow still. He didn't look at them. He looked at the monitors on the wall, his reflection staring back at him, dark, mud-stained, and lethal. "I've received intel on the traitor. They're moving a high-value asset through the Paiyu border crossing at 3 o'clock. We are abandoning the harbor operations immediately. All units are to redirect to the north." He watched their faces. He saw the flicker of confusion in Park's eyes, the subtle tightening of shoulders. It was a false trail, a ghost story designed to see who would run to tell it. "This is a silent strike," Du Huan continued, leaning against the steel table. No radio comms. No digital footprints. If a single word of this leaves this room before we hit the border, I'll know exactly which one of you cut your own throat. He dismissed them with a sharp nod, then retreated to the observation booth, a darkened room separated by one-way glass. He didn't look at the men as they filed out. He looked at his own phone, the one Choi monitored, and waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. A notification pinged on his secondary, encrypted tablet. He had mirrored Secretary Choi's private server months ago, a precaution he'd never thought he'd actually need to use. The screen flickered to life, showing an outgoing encrypted message from Choi's terminal to a ghost number at the Incheon harbor. The king is chasing shadows at the border. Move the asset to the secondary freighter now. Dispose of the leverage by dawn. The betrayal didn't sting. It burned with a cold, purifying flame. It wasn't just Park or the guards. It was the entire structure of his command. Choi wasn't just a traitor. He was the architect of Du Huan's misery, already moving to erase the leverage the moment he thought Du Huan was looking elsewhere. Du Huan stood up, his glassy eyes hardening into flint. He didn't need a loyal army. He didn't need a syndicate. He had the truth, and he had a destination. As he walked toward the elevator, he checked the weight of the Glock at his hip. The loyalty test was over. Every man in this building was now a target, and the only person left to trust was the woman whose voice was still echoing in his ears. The king was no longer leading a syndicate. He was a one-man war, and he was heading for the docks. Instead of heading for the exit, Du Huan turned back toward the private residential wing of the estate, his footsteps silent on the plush silk carpets. If the harbor was the destination, the origin of this betrayal was still rooted within these walls. He bypassed his own master suite and stopped before a narrow, inconspicuous servant's door hidden behind a velvet tapestry, a passage used by the cleaning staff to move between floors unnoticed. He remembered Sue mentioning a draft in this hallway months before her accident, a detail he had dismissed as the quirks of an old, sprawling mansion. Now, with the clarity of a man who had seen through the veil of a lie, he pressed his shoulder against the wood and felt the slight, unnatural give of a concealed latch. With a sharp shove, the wall clicked and pivoted, revealing a steep, dimly lit staircase that descended into the foundation of the house. The air at the bottom was sterile, smelling of industrial bleach and ozone. It wasn't a dungeon, it was a processing center. Du Huan stepped into a room bathed in the harsh, flickering light of a single fluorescent bulb. His breath hitched in his throat. Arranged on stainless steel tables were the artifacts of his mourning. There, under the clinical light, was Sua's favorite pearl necklace, the one he thought had melted in the car fire. Beside it lay her silk scarf, still stained with a faint trace of her rosewater perfume, and a stack of her journals he had believed were lost to the flames. They weren't just keeping her alive. They were stripping her identity piece by piece, cataloging her life as if she were evidence in a trial. On the far wall, a series of monitors displayed live feeds from every room in the house, including his bedroom. He saw himself on the screen, a grainy, black and white figure kneeling by an empty bed, weeping for a ghost that was being held just miles away. They had watched his grief like it was a performance, a psychological experiment designed to keep the king distracted while they dismantled his kingdom. Among the belongings, he found a small, leather-bound ledger. He flipped it open to find Secretary Choi's meticulous handwriting. It was a ledger of asset maintenance, detailing the exact calories Sua was fed, the medications used to keep her sedated, and the dates her phone was activated to echo her presence. A cold, visceral rage washed over him, more powerful than any grief he had ever known. They hadn't just stolen his wife. They had turned his home into a laboratory of psychological torture. He reached out, his fingers brushing the silk of her scarf, and for a fleeting second, the ethereal reflection of Sua appeared in a nearby mirror, her eyes wide with a silent plea. Du-Hwan didn't look away. He gripped the ledger until the binding cracked. He didn't need any more proof. He took a heavy industrial lighter from the table and flicked the flame. He wouldn't leave this evidence for the police or the board. He would leave only ashes. As the first curl of smoke rose toward the ceiling, Du-Hwan turned toward the garage. The unseen guard was no longer watching. The king was coming to tear down the walls. The elevator ascent felt like a countdown to an execution. When the doors slid open to the executive garage, Du-Hwan didn't head for his armored limousine or the fleet of black SUVs that usually trailed him like a funeral procession. Instead, he moved toward the far corner of the concrete bay, where a vintage, matte black motorcycle sat under a heavy tarp. It was a machine that didn't exist on the syndicate's official inventory, a ghost vehicle for a man who was about to become one. With a sharp tug, he ripped his company-issued smartphone from his pocket. The GPS icon flickered, a steady green eye that reported his every movement to the servers controlled by Secretary Choi. Du-Hwan didn't just turn it off. He placed the device on the concrete floor and brought the heel of his boot down with a sickening crunch of glass and lithium. He felt a grim satisfaction as the screen went dark. For the first time in a decade, the king was invisible. He mounted the bike, the cold leather seat biting through his suit trousers. As the engine roared to life, the sound echoed off the reinforced walls like a predator's growl. He didn't wear a helmet. He wanted to feel the sting of the soul rain. He wanted the cold to sharpen the edges of his rage. The garage gates hummed open, and Du-Hwan shot out into the night. The city was a blurred smear of neon and gray, the skyscraper lights overhead looking like distant, unblinking stars. He rode with a suicidal grace, weaving through the late-night traffic of the Mapo Bridge, leaning so low into the turns that his knee nearly brushed the slick asphalt. Behind him, the headquarters of the Kong Syndicate receded into the mist, a fortress built on a foundation of betrayal that he was no longer a part of. The air grew heavier, thicker with the industrial stench of the lowlands. As he crossed into the outskirts of Incheon, the luxury of the city was replaced by rusted skeletons of shipyards and the towering, skeletal silhouettes of cargo cranes. He killed the bike's headlight blocks away from the south terminal, coasting in the shadows of towering shipping containers that were stacked like the tombs of giants. He was alone. No backup, no bulletproof glass, and no army of loyalists. He was just a man with a gun and a promise. The rhythmic, mournful clanging of the buoy bells drifted over the water, exactly as Suah had described. Each toll was a pulse, guiding him deeper into the labyrinth of old iron and salt. The rain soaked through his suit, plastering his shirt to his chest, but the heat radiating from his skin was enough to turn the droplets into steam. The king had vanished, leaving only a hunter in his wake, and the harbor was about to learn that a man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous king of all. The scent of salt and rotting wood was thick enough to taste as Du-Hwan moved through the skeletal remains of the south terminal. The rain here didn't fall. It lashed, whipped into a frenzy by the wind coming off the Yellow Sea. Ahead, Warehouse 14 loomed like a hunched beast of corrugated steel, its windows shattered and dark. He didn't use the front entrance. He scaled a rusted fire escape, slipping through a high skylight and dropping into the rafters like a shadow, returning to its source. Below him, the warehouse was a cavern of crates and flickering work lights. In the center, tied to a bolted chair, was the woman from the photograph. Suah. She was dressed in the same flowing white silk she had worn on the day of the accident, the fabric now stained with the grime of a basement floor. Seeing her breathe was like watching a statue come to life. Every rise and fall of her chest was a strike against the 2 years of lies he had been forced to swallow. "Move her to the boat," a voice barked. It was Park, his own field lead, standing beside a dozen mercenaries armed with submachine guns. Choi wants the evidence erased before the sun hits the water. Do-hwan didn't wait for the order to be executed. He went over the railing, a silent predator falling from the sky. He landed on the first guard, the snap of bone lost in the roar of the wind outside. Before the others could turn, he was a whirlwind of practiced, lethal motion. He didn't use his gun yet. He used his hands, his rage turning his body into a weapon of pure, unadulterated vengeance. He moved through the mercenaries with a terrifying grace, parrying strikes and shattering joints, his eyes fixed solely on the chair in the center of the room. A bullet grazed his shoulder, tearing through his expensive wool suit, but he didn't even flinch. He disarmed Park with a brutal kick to the sternum and snatched a discarded blade from the floor. He cut through the final two guards with a speed that left them gasping in the dirt. Then, there was only the sound of his own heavy breathing and the rhythmic clanging of the harbor bells. Do-hwan stumbled toward the chair. His hands, covered in the blood of his enemies, trembled as he reached for her. As he cut the ropes, Suah slumped forward into his arms. The ethereal presence he had felt in his office, the semi-transparent ghost, vanished. In its place was the warmth of her skin, the frantic beat of her heart, and the soft, sobbing intake of her breath against his neck. "Do-hwan," she gasped, her fingers clutching his ruined jacket. He pulled her into his chest, burying his face in her hair. She wasn't a memory anymore. She wasn't a digital echo or a ghostly reflection in a window. She was flesh and bone, a living miracle in a house of death. The king had found his queen, and as he looked toward the door where the rest of Choi's men were surely gathering, his eyes glowed with a new, terrifying light. The rescue was over. The purge was about to begin. The sunrise over the Incheon harbor was not a herald of peace, but a witness to a reckoning. The mist hung low over the black water, heavy with the scent of spent gunpowder and the metallic tang of blood. Do-hwan stood on the rain-slicked concrete of the pier, his ruined suit jacket discarded, his white shirt stained with the proof of his survival. Beside him, wrapped in his heavy overcoat, Suah stood tall. Her face was pale, but her eyes were no longer those of a prisoner. They were the eyes of a queen who had returned from the dead. Before them, kneeling in the dirt, were the remnants of the conspiracy. Secretary Choi looked up, his face a mask of shattered composure, his glasses cracked, and his pristine suit covered in the filth of the warehouse floor. Surrounding them was the full assembly of the Kong Syndicate, hundreds of men who had been summoned in the dead of night to witness the true hierarchy of power. "You told me that grief was a burden," Do-hwan said, his voice carrying over the rhythmic clanging of the buoy bells with the weight of a funeral toll. He stepped toward Choi, his shadow stretching long and dark across the concrete. "You told me to stop looking for ghosts. But the only ghost here, Choi, is you." Choi tried to speak, but the words died in his throat as Do-hwan looked out at the gathered ranks of his empire. The silence was absolute. Every man there understood that the widower boss was gone. In his place stood a man who had walked through hell to reclaim what was his. "Loyalty is not a contract," Do-hwan announced, his gaze cold and unyielding. "It is a heartbeat, and those who try to stop that heart will find themselves buried in the silence they tried to create." He didn't need to pull the trigger himself. With a single, sharp nod, he turned his back on the traitors. As he walked toward the waiting car, the sound of a single, synchronized volley of gunfire echoed across the water, a final punctuation mark on a 2-year lie. He didn't flinch. He simply reached out and took Suah's hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. The climb back to the penthouse was different this time. The neon lights of Seoul no longer looked like electric rain. They looked like the jewels of a kingdom restored. As they stepped into the high-rise office, the morning sun flooded the room, washing away the shadows where the ghosts used to linger. Do-hwan walked to his desk and picked up the framed photograph. He didn't put it back down. Instead, he placed it in a drawer, turning to look at the living, breathing woman standing by the window. The throne was reclaimed, the traitors were ash, and for the first time in 700 days, the king was no longer alone in the dark. The weeks that followed the harbor reckoning did not bring the silence of the dead, but the vibrant, hummed energy of a house reborn. The Kong estate, once a mausoleum of marble and hushed whispers, now echoed with the simple domestic sounds of a life actually being lived. The heavy velvet tapestries that had hidden the traitors' passages were gone, replaced by open windows that invited the soul breeze to sweep away the last lingering scent of sandalwood and old grief. Du Huan sat at his mahogany desk, the late afternoon sun painting long, golden stripes across the wood. He was dressed in a sharp suit, but his collar was open, his posture relaxed for the first time in years. He wasn't looking at the city skyline or the monitors of his empire. His eyes were fixed on the doorway. Su'a walked in, her white dress catching the light, making her look not like a ghost, but like the very sun itself. She carried 2 cups of tea, the steam rising in lazy curls. There were no longer any cameras watching their intimacy, no hidden ledgers cataloging their breaths. They were simply a man and a woman who had survived the dark. She set a cup down before him, her hand lingering on his shoulder. It was a touch of warmth and weight, a constant reminder that the nightmare was over. "You're working late again," she teased, her voice a melody that had finally returned to its full, rich strength. "Just finishing one last thing," Du Huan replied, catching her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. Suddenly, a phone began to vibrate on the desk. It wasn't the encrypted burner or the company-issued device. It was a new phone, a symbol of their fresh start. The caller ID didn't say my life. It didn't need to. The person he had named his entire world was standing right beside him. Du Huan looked at the screen and then up at Su'a. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, a smile that reached his eyes and stayed there. He picked up the phone, his grip light and effortless. There was no shaking, no wide-eyed terror, no desperate pleading with the grave. "I'll be there in 5 minutes," he said into the receiver, his voice steady and full of life. He ended the call and stood up, sliding the phone into his pocket. He didn't need to check the grave sensors or sweep for bugs. He didn't need to fear the silence. He turned to Su'a, the woman who had called him back from the edge of madness, and walked with her toward the door. The resurrection of the heart was complete. The king was no longer mourning a tragedy. He was finally, truly home. The story of Kong Du Huan and Bei Su'a reminds us that even the most powerful walls cannot keep out the truth when love is the one knocking. It teaches us that while grief can be a weapon used by our enemies, our vulnerability, our willingness to listen to the impossible voice of those we love, is our greatest strength. True power isn't found in the silence of a controlled empire, but in the courage to face the shadows and bring the light back home. If you were moved by this journey of redemption, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories where the heart always finds its way back.